It had been months since James had received the strange letter, tucked in an old envelope, with a wax seal that looked like it belonged in another century. It seemed like something from an old fairy tale. The letter read, "Congratulations! You've won a ticket to the exclusive, once-in-a-lifetime event at the Lost Horizon Carnival. Join us for a night you will never forget. The carnival opens at midnight on the 13th. Only a select few are invited. A world of wonder, excitement, and secrets awaits you." At first, James had dismissed it as a prank. After all, who even heard of a carnival that had been abandoned for years, decades even? His curiosity peaked when the envelope contained nothing but a faded, torn ticket with an intricate design. No address, no company name, just the ticket. On the 13th, he found himself walking down an overgrown road leading to the outskirts of town, his heartbeat quickening with each step. He couldn't shake the odd feeling that something was wrong. He wasn't sure what had drawn him here. Was it the letter? The promise of mystery and the thrill of the unknown? The trees around him seemed to close in, the branches tangled in a dense embrace, casting long, eerie shadows on the dirt path ahead. The wind, still and quiet, only added to the disquiet in the air. When he finally saw it, through the fog and mist that hung in the air, a towering Ferris wheel, its lights flickering intermittently, rising out of the darkness like a ghostly silhouette. The Lost Horizon Carnival was not just abandoned, it was forgotten by the world. No one had spoken of it in years. The rusted gates stood wide open, creaking softly as if inviting him in, daring him to step through. With his heart pounding in his chest, James approached the entrance. The ticket burned in his pocket, its weight almost too much to bear. The gate was old, with peeling paint and vines crawling over the iron bars, but it was unlocked. He stepped forward, through the gate, and into the forgotten world of the carnival. As James walked deeper into the carnival grounds, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The fog seemed to gather thicker, swirling around his ankles like a living thing. The carnival itself was eerily silent. The rides, long abandoned and neglected, loomed over him, their outlines barely visible through the mist. The Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, the carousel, all of them stood as silent sentinels, their bright colors faded and chipped, their mechanical parts rusted and still. He wandered aimlessly, feeling a strange pull to the center of the park, where a grand, ornate tent stood in the distance. It seemed to beckon him, as though it were alive, drawing him in. Despite his better judgment, he walked toward it, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The tent, like the rest of the carnival, was ancient. Its canvas was torn in places, and the ropes that held it in place were frayed and weathered. But as he stepped inside, a strange warmth enveloped him, and the faint scent of caramel popcorn and cotton candy filled the air. The inside was just as eerie, though. Long-forgotten carnival games, rigged to ensure no one ever won, stood like decayed trophies. Old stuffed animals, once prizes for the lucky few, now sat in tattered piles, their glass eyes dull and lifeless. James couldn't help but feel that he was being watched. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The feeling, though, lingered. The air was thick, heavy with something unexplainable, and his stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and dread. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the stillness. A soft laugh, a child's laugh, echoed through the air. It was distant, as though it came from somewhere deep within the carnival. But it didn't sound like a normal laugh. It was hollow, almost sad, and it wasn't alone. As the laugh faded, James heard a voice, barely a whisper, coming from behind him. "Come play with us." He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but again the tent was empty. His pulse raced, his skin prickling with goosebumps. Was he imagining it? Or was something, or someone waiting for him to play? Against his better judgment, James ventured further into the carnival grounds. The soft glow from the Ferris wheel's flickering lights illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that danced and writhed like the ghosts of the past. The carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, stood at the center of the park, its music box playing a haunting, off-key tune that echoed into the night. He couldn't resist. James stepped closer to the carousel, his footsteps light but uncertain. The once pristine horses were now faded and cracked, their wooden bodies warped with time. Yet they seemed so lifelike. He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface of one of the horses, and a chill ran through him. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally cold. As he pulled his hand back, a strange sensation washed over him. His breath caught in his throat, and a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but once again, the carnival was still. "Come, sit with us." The voice was clearer now, more distinct. He could hear it, faintly, from the top of the carousel. His heart skipped a beat. He tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but the dread that settled in his stomach told him otherwise. Something was in the carnival, and it was waiting for him to join it. With a shaky breath, he slowly climbed up the carousel steps, the wood creaking under his weight. At the top, he was met with the sight of a strange figure, a man dressed in a faded carnival performer's costume. His face was obscured by a mask, and his eyes glinted through the slits like black holes, cold and unfeeling. The figure didn't move, but James could feel its gaze upon him, its presence closing in. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The air was thick with an unspoken promise of something terrible. The man tilted his head as if studying him, and then, without a word, he slowly reached out with a gloved hand and placed it on the edge of one of the horses. "You're late," the man whispered, his voice low and gravelly, as if he had not spoken in years. "We've been waiting for you." James stood at the entrance of the carnival, the broken wooden gates creaking in the cold wind. The distant sound of a carnival tune, warped and out of place, echoed through the silence like a forgotten memory. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the empty grounds. Despite the chilling atmosphere, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing him forward, something beyond curiosity. The gates were wide open, as if welcoming him in. No sign, no indication of why this place had been abandoned or why a ticket had mysteriously appeared on his doorstep. He glanced back at the long, dark road behind him, but the sound of the carnival music was too strong to ignore. It seemed to pull at him, beckoning him inside. With a deep breath, he stepped through the gates, his footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The carnival rides loomed in the distance, towering Ferris wheels and twisted roller coasters, their rusted skeletons swaying with the wind. The atmosphere was suffocating, the silence amplified by the creaking of the rides, as if they were waking from a long, slumbering nightmare. James walked past abandoned booths with faded signs that read Lucky Strikes, Fortune Teller, and Test Your Strength. The colorful paint was chipped, and the old, tattered tents looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The air carried a faint scent of burnt popcorn and something metallic, like old coins or forgotten dreams. As he walked deeper into the carnival, he saw a strange light flickering in the distance. It seemed to be coming from the Hall of Mirrors, a towering building that loomed like a ghost in the center of the grounds. The mirrors were shattered, yet the faint reflection of light seemed to dance across the broken glass. His curiosity got the better of him, and he made his way toward the building. The sound of carnival music grew louder as he approached, and he couldn't help but wonder why the place still felt so alive. The carnival was clearly abandoned, yet something felt unnervingly familiar about it, as if he had been here before, in another time, another life. The moment he entered the Hall of Mirrors, the temperature dropped. His breath formed mist in the air, and the once pleasant carnival music now sounded distorted, warped, like it was playing through a broken speaker. His footsteps echoed louder in the hall as he wandered through the mirrors. They twisted and contorted, reflecting strange, distorted versions of himself. Some mirrors showed him as a child, others as an old man, others still as a phantom-like figure with hollow eyes. He paused in front of one particular mirror. It was cracked down the middle, but the reflection it showed was unlike any other. There was someone standing behind him in the mirror. Not just any person. This figure had a face he recognized. It was a man with a twisted, grotesque grin, wearing a ragged clown costume. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and full of malice. James spun around in alarm, but no one was there. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. James frowned, confused. No children were around, and the carnival was supposed to be empty. He stepped back and then turned to leave, but before he could take another step, a voice echoed through the hall. It was soft at first, a whisper, and then it grew louder, clearer. "Welcome to my carnival," the voice said, the words heavy with an unnatural echo. "You're not alone here, James. You never have been." James froze. His heart raced and his pulse quickened. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. It sent chills down his spine. He spun around, trying to find the source, but the carnival hall appeared as empty and silent as it had been before. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" No answer came, only the unsettling sound of carnival music slowly fading in and out. It was then that James realized something was terribly wrong. The mirrors around him weren't just reflections. They were windows into something darker, something trapped between the real world and the nightmare that lingered in the carnival's haunted past. Suddenly, the mirror in front of him shifted again. The reflection of the clown had vanished, replaced by the figure of a woman. Her face was pale, her hair wild and disheveled. She seemed to be reaching out toward him, her fingers pressing against the mirror as if trying to escape. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with desperation. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice barely audible like a rustling breeze. "He's waiting for you, in the center of the carnival." Before he could react, the carnival music grew louder, deafening now, and the mirrors shifted once more. The woman's image dissolved into mist, and the mirror returned to its original, cracked form. The chilling laughter of children faded into the distance, and for a moment, all was silent. James felt an unease crawling over his skin, but his curiosity pushed him forward. Something in the woman's words stuck with him. She had said someone was waiting for him in the center of the carnival. He took a deep breath and exited the hall of mirrors, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the carnival grounds. As he walked toward the center, he could see the towering figure of the Ferris wheel in the distance, its lights flickering like dying stars. The air was thick, suffocating, and each step felt like it led him deeper into a place he was never meant to be. As James approached the Ferris wheel, he saw that the ride had been left half-constructed, its gondolas swaying in the breeze, creaking under the weight of time. The ride was still operational, but it seemed to have been abandoned long ago. Yet, something about it beckoned him. The carnival music faded out once more, replaced by the distant sound of what seemed to be a voice calling his name. "James! James, come closer." He hesitated, but then something deep within him pushed him forward. Maybe it was his curiosity, maybe it was the strange, almost magnetic pull of the carnival. But before he knew it, he was standing before the Ferris wheel. The operator's booth was empty, the seatbelt harnesses were undone, and the chains that held the gondolas were rusted and old. James knew he shouldn't get on, but something told him that the answers lay within the ride itself. Without a word, he climbed into one of the gondolas, settling into the seat, feeling the rusted metal creak beneath him. The ride jerked to life, slowly at first, as if waking from a long slumber. The Ferris wheel started to ascend, creaking and groaning as it climbed higher into the night sky. The ground below grew smaller, and the distant carnival lights began to shimmer like stars. And then, just as he reached the peak, the Ferris wheel stopped. The world around him seemed to hold its breath. Everything was eerily still. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faintest sound of footsteps approaching. James looked down below, but the carnival was now completely dark, as if it had been swallowed by shadows. The music had stopped completely, and the only sound he could hear was his own breathing and the blood rushing in his ears. Then, from behind, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Do you know what happened here, James?" James spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The voice was coming from nowhere and everywhere, echoing in his mind. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. Panic began to set in as his vision blurred, the carnival spinning in front of him. The whisper continued, growing louder, more menacing with each passing second. "Do you know why they disappeared, James? Why they're still here?" The Ferris wheel began to move again, slowly at first, but then it picked up speed, the wind rushing past him as the carnival below twisted into an ever-shifting nightmare of long-forgotten faces and fading lights. And then, with a jarring halt, the ride stopped once again. But this time it was different. The darkness was no longer just around him, it was inside him. The moment the Ferris wheel stopped, James' stomach lurched. His mind raced with confusion, dread, and disbelief. He tried to move, to call for help, but his throat felt like it had been coated in ice. His breath was shallow, the air thick with a heaviness that made it difficult to think clearly. It was as though the carnival itself was alive, breathing with him, trapping him inside. The once silent space around him now buzzed with an unsettling energy. The lights that had once flickered now glowed more brightly, but they weren't the warm, comforting lights of a carnival ride. They were cold, unnatural, a pale, ghostly glow that seemed to drain the life out of everything it touched. He looked down at the carnival grounds below and noticed something that made his blood run cold. The booths, the Ferris wheel, the roller coasters, they weren't empty anymore. They were filled with people, or at least he thought they were people. He squinted through the dim light. At first, it was hard to tell if they were real or just some twisted reflection of his own fears. But as he focused, he saw the figures more clearly, pale, skeletal figures in carnival costumes. Their faces were hollow, their eyes wide and empty, staring into the distance. Some of them were clapping their hands, but there was no sound. Others stood perfectly still, watching him with expressions that were both vacant and unsettlingly familiar. A sudden, sharp laughter erupted behind him. It was low, a haunting chuckle that reverberated through his spine, sending shivers down his body. He turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing before him was a man in a tarnished ringmaster's costume. His face was obscured by a top hat, but his grin, wide and unnervingly sharp, was visible like a jagged scar across his pale face. His teeth gleamed in the dull light as he slowly tilted his head, his eyes locking onto James with a predatory gleam. "You're finally here, James," the ringmaster said in a voice that sounded both welcoming and malevolent. "I've been waiting for you." James stumbled back, his body frozen in place. "W waiting for me?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What is this place?" The ringmaster stepped closer, the sound of his boots echoing unnervingly loud as he moved. "Oh, you've heard of the carnival, haven't you? It's been abandoned for years, forgotten by the living. But not by us." The ringmaster's grin widened. his voice dripping with malice. We never left. James felt the blood drain from his face. A chill ran through him, as though the carnival itself had suddenly swallowed him whole. The ringmaster's voice was slow and deliberate, as though he were savoring every word. Every performer, every guest who ever set foot here, they became part of us. Trapped in time, lost to the world. This carnival is a place between worlds, a place where we can never truly die. And you, James, you are about to join us. James shook his head, panic rising in his chest. No, I don't want to be a part of this. This isn't real. It can't be. His voice cracked as he took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. He tried to get off the Ferris wheel, but his legs refused to move. He was paralyzed with fear. The ringmaster took another step closer, the air growing colder with each movement. Oh, but it is real. Very real. You see, this carnival has always been here, waiting for someone like you. The ticket, you thought it was just a coincidence, didn't you? But nothing here is a coincidence. James felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he tried to process the ringmaster's words. The ticket had been a gift, a mystery, a simple invitation to visit a forgotten place. But now it felt like a trap. He had walked willingly into a nightmare. The carnival around him began to shift. The once silent figures in the booths started to move, slowly at first, and then more quickly, their movements jerky and unnatural. The laughter, soft at first, grew louder, echoing through the empty space. The Ferris wheel began to spin again, its creaking and groaning joining the chorus of twisted, distorted carnival music. James could feel the weight of the spirits around him, the lost souls of performers and visitors who had vanished from the world. They were here, in this place, unable to move on, and now they wanted him. Before he could react, the ringmaster raised one gloved hand, his fingers curling like a conductor leading a symphony. The carnival around them responded instantly. The carousel behind him suddenly whirred to life, its lights flickering. The horses, once lifeless, jerked into motion, their glassy eyes glowing red. James turned and saw the merry-go-round spin faster and faster, the eerie tune of the carnival organ blaring into the night air. The horses' mouths opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Their riders, hollow-eyed, lifeless beings, were strapped to the saddles, their limbs stiff, frozen in place. "Don't look away, James," the ringmaster warned with a cold smile. "The show is just beginning." The Ferris wheel creaked and groaned as it began to move faster. James felt his stomach drop with the sudden motion, the entire carnival spinning out of control, as if the very air was alive with malevolent energy. The figures in the booths, the performers, all started moving toward him. The air was thick with whispers now, so many voices, all calling his name. He tried to scream, but his voice was drowned by the cacophony of unsettling sounds. "Join us, James," a voice hissed from behind him. It was low, sinister, and oddly familiar. He turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the haunted house of mirrors, was the woman he had seen in the reflection earlier. Her face was no longer pale and ghostly. It was twisted, contorted into a grotesque, agonized expression. Her eyes were wide with terror, as if trapped in a perpetual state of agony. She held out her hand, her voice almost pleading. "Come with me. There's no escape. There's only us." James' heart pounded in his chest. His legs were still frozen, and the carnival around him was closing in, the haunted figures drawing nearer. He could feel their eyes on him, cold, lifeless, yet full of hunger. He took a step back, shaking his head, desperate to wake up from the nightmare that had become his reality. "No, I won't join you. I won't stay here." The ringmaster's voice rang out, dark and triumphant. "You already have, James. It's too late to turn back now. You're already part of the show. The carousel's music swelled louder, and the Ferris wheel picked up speed once more. The carnival was no longer just an eerie, abandoned sight. It had become a twisted, sentient entity, alive with the spirits of those trapped within it. And they all wanted him to stay. The woman in the mirror's reflection began to move closer to him, her outstretched hand growing larger, more menacing. James' pulse raced, and in that moment of fear and confusion, he finally managed to break free from his paralysis. He turned and bolted, running as fast as he could through the carnival grounds. He could hear footsteps behind him, the sound of countless spirits following him, their feet slapping the pavement, closing in. He darted past the haunted fortune-teller's tent, the air inside thick with a sense of foreboding, but he didn't stop to look. He needed to escape, to find a way out before he, too, was swallowed by the carnival's cursed grip. As he ran toward the exit, he could see the lights of the carnival flickering one last time. The sounds of laughter and carnival music swirled around him, growing louder with every step until the noise became deafening. The gates were just ahead, but James felt as though they were moving farther away with every step he took. The carnival wasn't going to let him leave. James' breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he ran, his feet pounding the cold, cracked pavement of the carnival grounds. The eerie sounds of distorted carnival music swirled around him, a discordant symphony that tugged at the edges of his sanity. His body screamed with exhaustion, but his fear pushed him forward, driving him toward the exit, the one thing that seemed to promise safety. But with each step, the gates seemed to move farther away, as if the carnival itself was pulling him back, trapping him within its ghostly embrace. The laughter behind him grew louder, sharper. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. The sound was enough to paralyze him. It was mocking, taunting him, like the carnival itself was enjoying his fear, feeding off of it. A shadow darted past him in the corner of his eye, and he stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. He spun around, his heart thudding in his chest. There, just out of reach, was a figure, the woman from the mirror. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes glowing with a cold, otherworldly light. She was moving toward him with a speed that defied the laws of nature, gliding over the ground like a shadow. Her hand reached out, the fingers curling as if to grasp him, to pull him into the carnival's eternal nightmare. "No!" James shouted, his voice desperate. He forced himself to move faster, his legs screaming in protest as he pushed them to go further. But no matter how fast he ran, the gates remained impossibly distant, as though they were always just beyond his grasp. The carnival rides around him began to spin faster, their movements jerky and erratic. The Ferris wheel creaked and groaned, the once bright lights flickering like dying stars. The carousel spun out of control, its horse's eyes glowing redder with each revolution. The laughter, the voices, they all became a swirling cacophony, suffocating him, pushing him deeper into madness. He could hear the ringmaster's voice again, low and sinister, carrying across the grounds like a whisper in the wind. "You can't escape, James. You belong to us now. You will always belong to us." Terror surged through his veins as he broke into a full sprint, ignoring the pain in his legs, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was no logic here, no way to understand the rules of this nightmarish place. All he knew was that he needed to get out. He needed to survive. He turned a corner, his feet sliding on the wet pavement, and stumbled into the Hall of Mirrors, a massive, twisted structure that had once been a funhouse attraction, but now stood as a grotesque labyrinth of glass and distortion. The mirrors, once playful and humorous, now seemed alive. They warped and twisted, reflecting James in 1,000 different ways. His face was stretched, his eyes wild, his expression distorted. But there was something else too. In every reflection, he saw someone else. A shadowy figure, lurking behind him in the glass, just out of reach, but always there, watching. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but when he turned to look at the mirrors again, the figure was gone. Only his own distorted reflection remained. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the mirrors began to shift. Slowly at first, and then with growing speed. They moved, rearranged themselves, closing in around him. He could hear footsteps, many footsteps, echoing through the hall. The reflection of the woman appeared again, her hollow eyes staring out from one of the mirrors, her grin widening. She stepped out from the glass, as if the reflection had become real, and now, she was in front of him. "You can't run from us, James," she whispered, her voice chilling and soft, as if it came from all directions at once. "You are ours now. We were waiting for you." The carnival seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. The laughter from the figures in the booths had become deafening, almost manic. The ringmaster's voice now joined the chorus of whispers, growing louder, more insistent. "Join us, James. Forever. The show will never end." The mirrors began to distort more rapidly, trapping him inside their reflection. He tried to move, to break free, but his body was paralyzed, locked in place by an unseen force. His arms and legs felt like they were filled with lead, unable to respond to his frantic thoughts. The ringmaster's figure appeared in the mirrors, his twisted grin now plastered across every surface. He was everywhere, watching, waiting. "Welcome to the carnival, James," the ringmaster's voice echoed 1,000 times over. "The fun is just beginning." James' breath came in ragged gasps. His body trembled with fear, his mind struggling to break free from the nightmare. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sights and sounds that threatened to consume him. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. He had to escape. When he opened his eyes again, the mirrors had stopped moving. The hall was silent, but the figures were still there, everywhere. In the glass, in the shadows, watching, and they were closing in. With every ounce of strength he could muster, James pushed forward, forcing his feet to move, his body to react. He stumbled through the maze of mirrors, his mind racing, his heart beating so loudly it drowned out everything else. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to get away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke free from the maze, bursting through the exit into the open air. But he didn't stop running, not even for a second. The carnival was still there, looming in the distance, its lights flickering. The sounds of twisted laughter, distorted music, and hollow voices chased him, echoing through the night. James didn't know how long he ran, or how far, but the further he got from the carnival, the quieter it became. And then suddenly there was nothing. The eerie sound stopped. The oppressive weight lifted. The carnival was gone. But James knew. Deep down he knew. It wasn't over. As he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, the reflection of the ringmaster appeared in the glass of a nearby store window, his grin still wide and cold. "You can run, James," the voice said, smooth as velvet, "but you'll never escape." And with that, the carnival faded into the distance, leaving James alone, haunted by the sound of laughter that would never stop echoing in his mind. James awoke with a start, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest as though it had never slowed since that night at the carnival. He lay in a bed, his own, in the safety of his apartment, but it felt foreign to him now. The blankets were too heavy, the room too still. His mind spun with memories, flashes of grotesque reflections in broken mirrors, of the carnival's malevolent laughter echoing around him, of the ringmaster's chilling voice urging him to join the never-ending show. His hands trembled as he pushed himself upright. His body was drenched in sweat, his mind foggy from the disorienting mixture of fear and exhaustion. The sunlight streaming in through the blinds did little to ease the cold dread that gripped him. He could feel it, something was still wrong. The carnival wasn't done with him. Shaking, he stumbled out of bed, his legs unsteady beneath him. He needed to clear his head. He needed to get out of this apartment and breathe. Maybe then, just maybe, he could convince himself it had all been a bad dream. As he stepped outside, the world seemed strangely quiet, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. He walked down the streets, every shadow feeling like a looming presence, every unfamiliar sound sending a chill down his spine. The sun was bright, but it did nothing to warm him. It only reminded him of the carnival's harsh, artificial glow. James tried to lose himself in the mundane, walking aimlessly through the city. He passed by familiar landmarks, the park, the corner cafe, but it all felt distant, hollow. He wanted to scream, to tell someone about what he had seen, but how could he? No one would believe him. No one would understand. And yet, despite the hustle and bustle of the city around him, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of something, a flash of movement, a fleeting figure in his peripheral vision. When he turned to look, there was nothing there. That evening, as he sat at home, trying to shake the unease that had clung to him all day, he heard it. A faint sound at first, like a distant melody carried on the wind. It was soft, almost pleasant, but it was unmistakable, the carnival's music. He froze, the blood draining from his face. It was impossible. The carnival was miles away, gone. Wasn't it? He stood up, his legs shaky as he moved toward the window. Outside, the street was dark and empty, but the music persisted, growing louder with each passing second. His eyes darted around the city, searching for the source, but there was nothing to see, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, the music was there, that twisted, haunting carnival tune, just as it had played in his nightmares. A chill ran down his spine as he reached for his phone, his fingers shaking. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming need to check. As he opened his text messages, his heart stopped cold. There, at the top of his inbox, was a message from an unknown number. The message was simple, chilling in its brevity. "The show is just beginning, James." His blood ran cold. The words blurred before his eyes. How did they know? How could they know? Suddenly, his phone rang, its shrill tone piercing the silence of his apartment. He nearly dropped it, his heart leaping into his throat. The caller ID read, Carnival. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The carnival hadn't ended. It had followed him. He had tried to escape, but it was never going to let him go. That night, as James lay in bed, the music continued to haunt him. The echoes of the carnival drifted through his apartment like a spectral presence, seeping into his very bones. He buried his head beneath his pillow, but it didn't help. The laughter, the voices, could still be heard, muffled but unmistakable. Then, just before he drifted into a restless sleep, he heard it. A soft tapping at his window. Slow at first, like the scratching of fingernails, then faster, more urgent. A light flickered in his room, casting eerie shadows against the walls. He hesitated for a moment, but then the tapping came again, louder, more insistent. With trembling hands, James threw back the covers and moved cautiously toward the window. He pulled the curtains aside, just enough to peer outside. The street was empty. There was no one there. But there, in the reflection of the window, something caught his eye. For a brief moment, he saw it, a figure standing in the street, staring up at him. The figure was pale, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something unmistakable about the shape. The silhouette was tall, thin and unnaturally still. It was a figure that didn't belong in the quiet night. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. And then, with a sudden, bone-chilling clarity, James recognized the figure. It was the ringmaster. His dark eyes gleamed in the reflection, and his mouth twisted into that same malevolent grin that had haunted James in the carnival's halls. Before James could react, the figure vanished, fading into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. He staggered back, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. This was no coincidence. The ringmaster had found him. The carnival had come for him, even here, even now. The room felt colder, the air thicker. The whispers returned, low and taunting, circling around him like a storm. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, searching for the source, but he found nothing. Then he saw it, the reflection in the window again. Only this time, it wasn't just the ringmaster standing there. There were others. The carnival performers, their faces twisted and hollow, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, all staring up at him. They were gathering in the street, just outside his window, waiting for him. James turned and bolted toward the door, but before he could even touch the handle, the room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to warp, elongating, bending, as though they were closing in on him. The very air felt heavier, suffocating. He reached for his phone, his fingers numb with fear, but the screen flickered and went black. The carnival was here. It was real, and it was never going to let him go. James' breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the window, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. The carnival had come for him, and it wasn't just a haunting memory anymore. It was real, manifesting in his very apartment, twisting his reality. The laughter, that twisted, mocking laughter, grew louder. It echoed through the walls, reverberating in his mind, as though it were right beside him. He could hear the faint tinkling of carnival music again, too barely audible but ever present. The music, like a siren's call, drew him into its unrelenting grip. He reached the door, his hand shaking as he gripped the handle. But as soon as he tried to turn it, a strange, metallic clink sounded behind him, and he froze. He didn't need to look. He could feel it. Someone was there. Someone in the room with him. Slowly, cautiously, James turned around, his legs like lead beneath him, unwilling to obey his mind's frantic command to run. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, its face partially obscured in shadow, but its outline unmistakable, the ringmaster. The figure stood eerily still, just like the time he had seen it outside his window. But this time, the ringmaster was not alone. The carnival performers were there, standing silently in the shadows, their eyes gleaming with malice. The strongman's towering figure loomed near the door, his bulging muscles rippling with unnatural strength. The contortionist twisted her body into impossible angles, her face frozen in an agonizing smile. The fire breather stood at the far corner, holding a torch that sputtered with flame, but the flame danced like it had a life of its own, consuming the air around it. James's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. These weren't just memories. These weren't just nightmares. They were here. They were alive, and they were coming closer. James, the ringmaster's voice slithered through the silence. It was low, smooth, and terrifying. His words wrapped around James like a constricting snake, squeezing the air from his lungs. You didn't think you could leave, did you? You've seen the show, and now, you'll be part of it. James stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as the room seemed to close in on him. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. The performers began to move, slowly at first, but with growing urgency. Their eyes never left him, never blinked, as they crept closer. The fire breather raised his torch high, and the flames flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The contortionist twisted her limbs, folding into grotesque positions that defied the laws of nature. And the strong man took a step forward, his footfalls heavy and deliberate, sending a tremor through the floor. James felt the walls of the room closing in. His heart was racing, blood pounding in his ears. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the terror that gripped him told him otherwise. He was trapped in the carnival's twisted, eternal show. The ringmaster's grin widened, his sharp teeth gleaming in the low light. You were never meant to leave, James. The carnival always claims its performers. Always. And now, it's your turn. James fought against the fear, fought against the overwhelming sensation of being trapped, but it was useless. He could feel himself slipping into madness, his mind unraveling under the pressure. But then, something inside him stirred, a small flicker of defiance. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. With every ounce of strength he could muster, James bolted for the door, his body moving on pure instinct. He didn't care where he was going, he just had to get out. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. He twisted the handle, but it didn't give. He yanked it again, harder this time, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if the door itself had become part of the carnival's trap, holding him in place. Desperation surged through him, and with a scream of frustration, James slammed his shoulder against the door. He hit it again and again, his body throbbing with the impact, but the door refused to yield. Behind him, he could hear the performers moving closer, their footsteps echoing in the silence, like a drumbeat signaling his doom. Then a voice, a familiar voice, echoed in his mind. It was the voice of the woman who had warned him, the one who had given him the ticket to the carnival. She had said, "The carnival calls to those who have seen it. You cannot escape what it has chosen for you." James's breath caught in his throat. The voice was right. He had been chosen. The carnival had marked him, and no matter where he went, no matter what he did, it would never let him go. But there was one thing he hadn't tried, one thing he had ignored in his panic and fear. His reflection, the mirror. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw it. The large, ornate mirror across the room, its surface dark and distorted. But as his gaze fixed on it, his reflection did not mirror him as it should. Instead, it seemed to move on its own, shifting, swirling, as though it had a life of its own. The reflection in the mirror was smiling, a wide, knowing grin that mirrored the ringmaster's, only more sinister. In the reflection, the performers were there too. They weren't just in the room, they were inside the mirror. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The mirror was a doorway. It was a gateway to the carnival, a link between the real world and the twisted nightmare realm that had ensnared him. Without thinking, James lunged toward the mirror, his hand reaching for it, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the world around him seemed to shudder. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the carnival music blared in his ears, louder than ever. Then, everything went black. James's body jerked violently, as if yanked into another realm. His mind felt like it was being stretched, pulled apart, his very soul being wrenched from his body. For a moment, he could see nothing but darkness, a deep, empty void that seemed to have no end. His breath caught in his throat as he felt himself falling, tumbling into a bottomless abyss. Then, the darkness gave way to light, flickering, harsh light that seemed to come from nowhere, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the ground. James landed on hard, cold concrete with a loud thud. Pain shot through his body, but it was a distant feeling, one that didn't seem to matter in this strange, otherworldly place. He pushed himself up, his legs unsteady as he staggered to his feet. The world around him was bizarre, distorted. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness, and the smells, stench of old carnival food, burnt rubber, and the faint scent of something metallic, almost like blood, choked him. The carnival was alive, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't a mere collection of abandoned rides or decayed structures. This place was more. It was alive. The ground was cracked and warped, as though the earth itself was bending to the whims of some dark, malevolent force. Old carnival tents, faded and tattered, loomed in the distance, swaying with the wind. But there was no wind. There was only a steady, unnerving stillness. James spun around, his eyes scanning his surroundings. The Ferris wheel towered above him, its rusty, corroded wheel creaking slowly, turning in fits and starts, as if it had a mind of its own. The carousel, its once beautiful horses now grotesque and twisted, sat motionless, but James could feel their eyes following him. He knew they were watching, waiting. It's real. It's all real. The carnival's atmosphere was suffocating, wrapping around him like a thick blanket. The sense of being trapped, ensnared, gnawed at his mind. There was no exit, no way out. He had stepped into a nightmare, and the carnival would never let him go. The distant sound of carnival music drifted through the air, faint, distorted, like a melody played on an old, broken record. It seemed to seep from the very ground beneath him, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. The laughter, too, was back, distorted and muffled, echoing through the air like it came from deep within the earth. And then he saw them, figures, moving slowly through the mist that now crept across the carnival grounds. The performers. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their bodies twisted and broken in ways that should not have been possible. The strong man's muscles bulged, but his skin was stretched taut, pale and decaying. The contortionist twisted into grotesque shapes, her body folding at impossible angles as her head lolled to one side in a sickening display. The fire-breather's face was warped, half-burned, with a permanent grimace etched into his features. They were the same performers he had seen in his apartment. No, not the same. They were worse. Twisted by something ancient, something evil, they were no longer just ghosts. They were part of this place, bound to it for eternity. James's heart raced as he backed away, his breath shallow and rapid. What is this place? What is happening to me? A soft, raspy voice echoed through the air, low and cold, sending chills down his spine. You shouldn't have come here, James, it whispered. You can never leave. You are ours now. James turned sharply, his pulse quickening as the figure of the ringmaster stepped out of the shadows. He was just as James remembered, tall, gaunt, his eyes gleaming with malice. But there was something different this time. His eyes seemed darker, more hollow, like endless pits that swallowed everything around them. The ringmaster smiled, his lips curling upward in a twisted grin. You thought you could escape, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. You thought you could just leave. But you're part of the show now. And the show never ends. James tried to speak, to shout, to beg for mercy, but his throat was tight, his words caught somewhere deep inside him. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The ringmaster took a step closer, and James felt a wave of suffocating cold wash over him. His vision blurred, his mind faltering under the weight of it all. The carnival was closing in, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. Don't fight it, the ringmaster continued, his voice smooth and hypnotic. You'll understand soon enough. This is where you belong. Forever. The air around James grew colder, and the mist thickened, swirling around his legs. He could feel the presence of the performers behind him, their eyes boring into him, their silent movements like a wave of pressure pushing him down. He was losing control, losing himself. With a burst of strength, James forced himself to move, staggering forward, desperate to escape the ringmaster's gaze. But the moment he took a step, the ground beneath him trembled. The carnival rides, the tents, the lights, they all seemed to flicker, as if they were alive, responding to his every movement. A strange, high-pitched sound filled the air, and James's eyes snapped to the Ferris wheel. The wheel began to turn, its rusty chains creaking loudly, as if urging him forward. But the moment he took another step, something shifted. The ground beneath him cracked open, a yawning chasm opening up at his feet. "No, not yet," the ringmaster's voice boomed, the sound twisting and distorting. James didn't think, he just ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get away. The carnival was alive, and it was pulling him in deeper, faster, with every step. The rides groaned, the air thick with whispers and laughter, and James felt a cold hand graze the back of his neck. Suddenly, he found himself in front of the carousel. The horses were no longer just twisted sculptures. They were alive, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths open as if they were ready to scream. James turned to run, but the sound of hooves pounding against the ground echoed behind him, louder than the carnival music. Something was chasing him. James's heart hammered in his chest as he bolted forward, the eerie sound of hooves getting closer, like a thunderous stampede behind him. He dared not look back, but he could feel the oppressive weight of the spirits, their presence tangible in the air. Every breath felt labored, every step like it was sinking deeper into quicksand. The carnival was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on fear. His eyes scanned the area frantically, looking for any kind of escape, but everything around him seemed to warp and shift, like the carnival itself was rearranging in real time, playing with his sense of space and direction. The once colorful tents were now dark and tattered, their fabric fluttering in an unnatural wind that seemed to come from all directions. The carnival rides, which had once seemed so distant and lifeless, now felt like towering, monstrous entities looming over him, trapping him within their grasp. The carousel's haunting music was now a deafening, high-pitched wail, echoing through his mind, each note crawling under his skin, amplifying his panic. His footsteps faltered as he stumbled, and he felt a cold, clammy hand reach out from behind, brushing against the back of his neck. He whipped around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the distorted shapes of the carnival rides and the shadows that danced with them. He turned back toward the Ferris wheel, which loomed like a dark sentinel in the distance. It was moving again, its massive wheel creaking with a slow, grinding motion. The seats were now filled with figures, silhouettes of people, their faces obscured, but their presence undeniable. James knew instinctively that they weren't just illusions. These were the lost souls of the carnival, the souls that had never left. They had become part of the show, trapped in an endless cycle, just like the performers. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. James's body trembled as he realized the truth. The carnival was not just haunted, it was a prison that held the spirits of those who had entered, never to leave. The spirits of performers, visitors, and now, perhaps, his own. The ground beneath him trembled again, and a guttural sound echoed from the depths of the earth. The carnival itself seemed to pulse with life, its heartbeat thumping in rhythm with the rush of blood in his ears. He felt a pull, an almost magnetic force, that tugged him toward the Ferris wheel, toward the figures in the seats. No, he had to fight it. He had to resist. But his legs moved of their own accord, drawn to the wheel like a moth to a flame. His chest tightened, his breath shallow and rapid. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body ignored him, carrying him closer to the Ferris wheel, closer to the souls that awaited. The Ferris wheel creaked louder, the seats swaying as if in anticipation. The figures within them turned their heads, their eyes locking onto James with a chilling intensity. Their faces were pale, distorted, their eyes wide and unblinking. They looked like people, but they weren't. They were something other, something trapped, something twisted by the curse of the carnival. James reached the Ferris wheel, his heart in his throat. His body was still moving, but his mind screamed in protest. The ringmaster's words echoed in his ears. "You are ours now." He was close enough now to feel the cold metal of the Ferris wheel's structure pressing against his skin. The spirits in the seats began to reach out toward him, their hands long and skeletal, their fingers stretching unnaturally, like they were trying to pull him into the wheel itself. "No," James whispered, barely able to form the words. "I don't want this. I don't belong here." But the spirits didn't respond to his pleas. Instead, they continued to stare at him, their eyes cold and empty, their expressions vacant of all emotion. The carousel music grew louder, more distorted, almost as if it was becoming a part of him. He felt his sanity slipping away, the noise invading every corner of his mind. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel creaked violently, and one of the figures, a woman in a torn, tattered carnival dress, leaned out of her seat, her arm reaching toward him. Her eyes were wild, crazed, as if she hadn't seen another living soul in centuries. She spoke, her voice hollow and rasping. "You think you can escape? You can't. We are all here forever." The words stung, like ice-cold needles piercing his skin. James recoiled, a wave of dread crashing over him. He wanted to run, to scream, but it was too late. The pull was too strong. He felt himself being drawn into the Ferris wheel, his body moving against his will. With a sudden lurch, he was lifted off his feet and swung toward one of the seats. The woman's hand wrapped around his wrist, her grip cold and tight, dragging him upward. He tried to fight, tried to tear himself free, but her grip was unyielding, and the carnival had him, body, mind, and soul. The Ferris wheel began to spin faster, faster, until the world around him blurred into a swirl of color and motion. The spirits in the seats continued to watch, their faces empty, their eyes lifeless. The carnival music reached a deafening crescendo, the sound echoing in every corner of his mind, making it impossible to think, to breathe, to move. And then everything stopped. The Ferris wheel screeched to a halt, and James was thrown forward, landing hard on the ground. The world around him was still. The carnival was silent. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but the silence was worse than the noise. It was like the calm before a storm, a dead lull before the next wave of terror. He slowly stood up, his body shaking, his mind spinning. He looked around, and the carnival was gone. There were no rides, no tents, no lights. There was only an endless stretch of dark, empty ground, stretching into nothingness. Had he escaped? Was it over? But then, a voice whispered from the shadows. A voice that was not the ringmaster's, not any of the performers, but something else. Something darker. "Welcome to the final act, James." And from the darkness, the ringmaster's figure appeared, his smile wider than ever before. James knew with a cold certainty that he had never truly escaped. The carnival was inside him now, forever.